It is 5:02 in the morning on a Thursday in March 2026, and the lights along Dock C of the Harborview Charter Complex, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, are still dark. Then they are not. 6 portable flood lamps hit the floating docks simultaneously, 4,000 lumens each, and the water turns white. Agents in HSI tactical vests pour through the gate at the landside entrance. US Marshals move along the finger piers from the east, cutting the padlock on the slipside compound with hydraulic shears before the sound of the bolt hitting the dockboards has finished echoing across the basin. The count at breach: 31 agents across 4 docks. 3 entry teams, 2 Coast Guard interceptor boats holding position 200 yards offshore, engines idling, 1 helicopter circling without lights at 800 feet. At the end of Slip 14, a 62-foot azimuth motor yacht called the Paloma Blanca sits dark and quiet, her fenders pressed against the dock bumpers, her boarding ladder down. The ladder should not be down. The lead marshal, a 17-year veteran of the Southern Florida Fugitive Task Force, raises his right fist. The team stacks at the transom. He signals. They board. The man they find below decks, in the forward stateroom, is already awake. He is dressed. His phone is in his hand, and the screen is still lit. He does not run. He does not fight. He looks at the badge presented to him, and he says nothing at all. His name, for the purposes of this case, is Marco Delgado, a composite identity for a figure the task force had spent 68 days, 14 hours, and roughly 40 minutes hunting across South Florida. His real designation inside the investigation was simpler. They called him the Fixer. When agents walked him up the boarding ladder into the floodlit morning, they were not just closing a fugitive warrant. They were closing a 68-day window into one of the most sophisticated money laundering pipelines ever routed through the American charter industry. One that moved an estimated $1.6 billion through luxury boat bookings, shell corporations, and marina slip fees, and left almost no trace that any port authority ever reconciled. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because 68 days earlier, this investigation did not exist. There was no task force, there was no target, there was only a single anomaly, 3 lines buried in a tower data report that a Marshals Service analyst almost deleted. The anomaly looked like noise. Marshals Service analysts processing routine fugitive location queries work through enormous volumes of cell tower records, license plate reader hits, and financial flag reports every single shift. The work is methodical and largely unremarkable. Most of what the software flags turns out to be coincidence. A phone that bounced off a tower near a known location, a car registered to someone with a similar name, a transaction that looked suspicious until it didn't. On the morning of January 14, 2026, an analyst named in court records only as Senior Intelligence Analyst M. Torres was processing a batch of Tower Association queries tied to a fugitive money mover who had skipped a federal court date in Miami 18 months prior. The warrant was active, but cold. The subject had not surfaced in any monitored financial system, any border crossing, or any law enforcement contact in over a year. Then Torres noticed something in a subquery she had almost not run. A burner phone, a prepaid device that had never been associated with the fugitive's file, purchased for cash at a convenience store in Hialeah, had pinged the same marina Wi-Fi access point on 3 separate nights. Night 1, January 6th. Night 2, January 9th. Night 3, January 12th. 3 pings, 72 to 96 hours apart. Same access point. Same device identifier. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. The device never connected to the internet. It never sent a message. It just associated with the network, the way a phone does when it recognizes a saved Wi-Fi name, and then dropped off within minutes. Most analysts would file it and move on. Torres did not move on. She pulled the marina's name, Harborview Charter Complex, Fort Lauderdale. She cross-referenced the device's hardware identifier against a database of burner phones flagged in prior financial crime investigations in the Southern District. No direct match. But there was a partial hit. The device's manufacturer batch number overlapped with a lot of 40 prepaid phones purchased by a shell entity that had appeared in a 2024 DEA financial intelligence report connected to a cartel-affiliated, money-moving network operating out of South Florida. That is not a match. That is a thread. Torres wrote it up. She flagged it for the task force supervisor. She expected it to sit in a queue. It did not sit in a queue. The Southern Florida Fugitive Task Force, a joint unit pulling resources from the US Marshals Service, Homeland Security Investigations, and the DEA, convened an initial assessment meeting within 48 hours of Torres's flag. The case was thin. The connection between the burner phone and the fugitive was, at that point, entirely circumstantial. But the task force supervisor, a supervisory deputy US Marshal with 22 years in the service, had worked enough financial crime cases to know what a repeating marina Wi-Fi pattern might mean. The fixer, if this was him, was not staying at the marina. He was visiting it, regularly, at night, on a predictable schedule. That predictability was a vulnerability. The task force opened a formal investigation on January 16, 2026, day one of what would eventually become a 68-day operation. The first week was surveillance only. 2 Marshals deputies rented a vehicle and parked it in a lot overlooking the marina entrance on Harborview Drive, beginning the night of January 17th. They logged every vehicle entering and exiting between 8 p.m. and 4 a.m. over a 5-night window. 43 vehicles total. License plate reader equipment mounted inside the rental pulled the plates automatically and fed them into the task force database in real time. Of the 43 plates, 31 came back clean. 8 were registered to individuals with no criminal history and no connection to any open investigation. 3 came back to rental car companies, untraceable without a subpoena. 1 plate, a silver Dodge cargo van, Florida registration, came back to a name that had appeared as a listed associate in a 2023 financial intelligence file connected to charter industry fraud. The van did not enter the marina lot. It parked on the street 2 blocks north, engine running, for approximately 40 minutes on the night of January 20th, then left. Nobody got out. The task force noted it and kept watching. On the night of January 23rd, 7 days into surveillance, the van reappeared. Same street, same position, engine running. This time it stayed for 61 minutes, and this time a second vehicle, a white Honda Pilot, no plates visible on the rear, which is itself a violation, pulled alongside it briefly before both vehicles departed. The task force now had 3 data points forming a pattern: the Wi-Fi pings, the van, and the Honda. Not enough for a warrant. Enough to justify expanding the operation. The expansion came in 2 forms. First, HSI brought in a financial crimes unit from their Miami field office to begin tracing the corporate structure of the entities that operated Harborview Charter Complex. This is the part that took the longest and produced the most striking numbers. What they found, over the following 3 weeks, was not a marina, it was an architecture. Harborview Charter Complex was registered as a Florida limited liability company. Its managing member was a Delaware holding company. That Delaware entity was wholly owned by a Cayman Islands trust. The trust's beneficiary structure led to a Panama City law firm that specialized in, and I am quoting from the task force's financial intelligence summary here, discrete maritime asset management. The Panama firm connected to 4 additional shell charter companies operating under different names across South Florida, the Bahamas, and the Dominican Republic. Those 5 entities combined had processed, over a 30-month period, an estimated $1.6 billion in charter booking revenue. Revenue that did not correspond to any verifiable fleet of vessels, any recoverable client manifests, or any Port Authority reconciliation of actual marina traffic. $1.6 billion. I spent considerable time going through the financial intelligence summary on this case, and one detail kept nagging at me: the billing rates. The shell charter companies were invoicing clients at rates between $4,000 and $18,000 per day, plausible for a high-end luxury charter. But the bookings were structured in ways that made verification nearly impossible. Clients paid through wire transfers routed through multiple correspondent banks. Booking confirmations went to email addresses that resolved to privacy-protected domains. The vessels listed on the manifests existed on paper but could not be located at the documented slip addresses on the documented dates. The charter industry, by design, moves. A yacht that was in Fort Lauderdale on a Tuesday could legitimately be in the Bahamas by Wednesday and back by Friday. The paper trail is thin by nature, and for a money mover who needed a business that could absorb enormous cash flows without triggering obvious red flags, a charter company was nearly ideal. This is what I keep coming back to with this case. The fixer did not invent a new method. He perfected an existing one. The charter industry has operated with minimal federal financial oversight for decades, and the gap between what port authorities log and what actually moves through marina slips is wide enough to hide a billion-dollar pipeline. The second expansion of the operation was more immediate and more dangerous. On January 28, day 13, HSI requested authorization for a covert technical operation, the placement of a GPS tracking device on a tender boat associated with one of the Harbor View slips. A tender is a small runabout used to ferry people and cargo between a larger yacht and the dock. They move constantly, attract little attention, and are rarely logged in any systematic way. The specific tender in question, a 14-foot rigid inflatable boat, white, no visible name, had been spotted on 2 nights of surveillance, pulling up to the finger pier at slip 14, and then departing before anyone from the marina staff appeared to notice. The task force believed the tender was the fixer's primary transit between whatever offshore or remote location he was staying at and his nighttime visits to the marina. Getting the device on the tender required a physical approach to the vessel while it was in the water. That approach had to happen without triggering any counter-surveillance the fixer might have in place, and the task force had to assume he had counter-surveillance, because a fugitive who had stayed invisible for 18 months in South Florida either had very good instincts, very good help, or both. The placement operation took place on the night of January 30th. 2 HSI Marine agents, in civilian clothing, approached the tender from the waterside using a kayak, drawing less acoustic attention than any motorized vessel, and affixed a Crossroads GPS unit to the underside of the RIB's bow flotation collar in under 4 minutes. Everything went as planned, except for one thing. At 11:47 p.m., approximately 8 minutes after the agents had cleared the area, the GPS unit went active and transmitted its first location ping. The location was slip 14, as expected. The second ping, 6 minutes later, placed the device 200 yards offshore, moving southeast at approximately 12 knots. The tender was already gone. Someone had moved it before the agents were even out of the water. The task force spent 48 hours unsure whether the device had been discovered. If the fixer had found the tracker, the investigation was potentially burned. He might surface the device in a different location to mislead, then vanish again. Then, on February 2nd, the tracker pinged from a position 14 miles south of Harbor View, anchored in a residential canal off the New River. It had not moved in 36 hours. It was not being driven as a decoy. It was just sitting there. He had moved it because he had moved himself, not because he had found the device. The task force exhaled. From February 2nd forward, the operation shifted into a higher tempo. The GPS data gave them movement patterns. The tender made regular runs, every 2 to 4 days, between the New River position and Harbor View. The timing was irregular enough to suggest the fixer was varying his schedule deliberately, but not so irregular that a pattern couldn't be extracted. The task force built a probability model. On any given night, if the tender had been stationary for more than 72 hours, the probability of a Harbor View visit in the next 48 hours was above 60%. That model, as it turned out, was accurate in 8 out of 11 tested instances. Meanwhile, the financial investigation was producing results that kept escalating the stakes. HSI's Financial Crimes Unit had subpoenaed records from 3 of the 5 shell charter companies through the Southern District of Florida. The returns came in slowly. Some required letters rogatory to the Cayman Islands, which added weeks. But by mid-February, the picture was clear enough to brief to a federal grand jury. The scheme worked like this. A cartel-affiliated financial network in South America would convert drug proceeds into wire transfers routed through a network of cryptocurrency exchanges and then into fiat currency held in accounts at 3 correspondent banks, one in Panama, one in Belize, one in the Dominican Republic. Those funds would then be transferred to the shell charter companies as payment for charter reservations. The charter companies would issue confirmations, book the transactions as revenue, pay out fictitious vessel operating expenses to other entities in the network, and retain a commission. The remainder, cleaned, documented as legitimate business income, would flow back through the corporate structure as distributions, eventually reaching beneficiaries in the United States and abroad. The elegance of it, if you want to call it that, was the layering. By the time money reached the top of the structure, it had passed through enough entities, in enough jurisdictions, with enough paper documentation, that a typical bank compliance review would see what looked like a profitable maritime business. 39 individuals across 5 countries had, at various points, participated in the scheme. Most of them had no idea who they were ultimately working for. But here's what nobody expected. The fixer was not just a money mover. He was the operational architect. He had designed the corporate structure himself, had recruited the shell company managers, had personally negotiated the correspondent banking relationships, and, this detail emerged from a cooperating witness later in the investigation, had spent 3 years studying the charter industry before building the network. He had worked briefly as a legitimate charter broker. He knew the business from the inside, which made him exceptionally hard to replace. And it meant that taking him down was not just about closing a fugitive warrant. It was about dismantling a system that had taken years to build, and that, without him, the cartel network behind it could not easily reconstitute. That raised the pressure on the task force in a specific way. They needed him in custody before he realized how close they were, because a man with his resources and his network, given even a few hours' warning, might disappear again for another 18 months, or longer. By the end of February, the operation had been running for 45 days. The task force had GPS data, financial records, surveillance logs, and a cooperating witness who could place the fixer at the center of the scheme. What they did not have was a clean confirmation of his physical presence at Harborview that was recent enough to justify a tactical breach. The GPS data tracked the tender. It did not track him. The van sightings were surveillance logs, not confirmed identifications. The task force needed to put eyes on the target directly, to confirm that the man using the tender and visiting the marina was, in fact, their fugitive. That requirement drove the operation's most creative and most operationally risky move. On March 3rd, day 47, an HSI undercover agent, posing as a high-net-worth client, booked a consultation with Harborview Charter Complex for a private charter of the Paloma Blanca for a 10-day cruise to the Bahamas. The booking was made through the shell company's legitimate appearing website for a total of $180,000, with a $50,000 deposit wired from an undercover HSI account. The consultation was scheduled for March 7th in the marina's dockside office. The goal was not to make the booking. The goal was to get inside the operation's orbit and make an identification. On March 7th, the undercover agent arrived at the marina office at 2 p.m. He was met by a marina manager, a middle-aged man with no criminal record who appeared to be a legitimate, if unwitting, employee of the shell structure. They discussed the charter. The manager showed him the vessel. He toured the Paloma Blanca. At 3:17 p.m., while the undercover was still aboard the vessel, a second individual arrived at the slip. He was described in the agent's report as approximately 40 years old, medium build, wearing a gray linen shirt and dark sunglasses, carrying a canvas bag. He spoke briefly with the manager in Spanish. The manager nodded and left. The second individual then walked toward the vessel. The undercover agent was face-to-face with a man matching the physical description of their fugitive. They spoke for 11 minutes. The conversation was recorded. The man discussed the charter, the vessel's recent service history, and the pricing structure in a way that demonstrated detailed operational knowledge of the booking system. He did not give his name. He did not produce identification. But he confirmed details about the charter network that only someone inside the management structure could have known. The undercover agent departed. He called in the contact at 4:02 p.m. The voice recording went to the cooperating witness that evening. The witness confirmed the identification in under 4 minutes. They had him. The task force now had 60 hours of planning ahead of it before the breach could go. Not because the tactical planning required 60 hours. The Southern Florida Fugitive Task Force had conducted hundreds of fugitive apprehensions, and the logistics of a marina breach were demanding but not novel. The 60 hours were required because of a complication that emerged at 9 a.m. on March 8th. The tender's GPS pinged from a new location, a fuel dock at the Lauderdale Marine Center, approximately 4 miles north of Harborview. The device showed the tender had moved overnight, refueled, and was now in transit back south. But the transit was slower than normal. The device was moving at under 5 knots, which for a 14-foot RIB suggested either a heavy load or a mechanical problem. It arrived back at the New River Canal position at 1:14 p.m. and went stationary. The significance: if the fixer was taking on fuel and moving cargo, he might be preparing to leave the area entirely. A vessel that is fueled and loaded can clear South Florida waters in under 6 hours. Once offshore in a private vessel, locating him again without Coast Guard pursuit, which would require separate authorization and carried its own operational risks, became dramatically more complicated. The task force supervisor convened an emergency assessment at 2 p.m. on March 8th. The question on the table: do they move early, before they have the full arrest package assembled, or do they hold and risk losing him? The decision came down to the GPS. As long as the tender was stationary and the Paloma Blanca was in slip 14, they had him bracketed. The moment either one moved without surveillance coverage, the calculation changed. They held, but they moved the breach timeline up by 24 hours. Breach was set for 5 a.m. on March 13th, day 68. The HSI aviation unit repositioned its surveillance aircraft to a holding pattern over Biscayne Bay by 11 p.m. on March 12th. 2 Coast Guard Defender-class response boats took up positions offshore at 1 a.m. The ground team staged at a commercial parking structure on Harborview Drive, 4 blocks from the marina entrance, invisible from the water, beginning at 3:30 a.m. At 4:15 a.m., a final GPS ping confirmed the tender was stationary at the New River Canal. The Paloma Blanca had not moved from slip 14. The marina's perimeter cameras, accessed through a warrant served 2 weeks prior, showed no activity on Dock C. At 4:47 a.m., the task force supervisor issued the 30-minute warning. At 5 a.m., the flood lamps were powered and staged. At 5:02 a.m., they went live. What followed was 74 seconds of tactical execution. The hydraulic shears cut the slipside compound lock at 5:02:11. The Marina Gate team breached the landside entrance at 5:02:18, 7 seconds behind schedule. A fire door had been left ajar, and the first deputy nearly missed it in the dark, costing the team 4 seconds recovering their stack formation. They cleared it and moved. Dock A cleared at 5:02:40, no contact. Dock B cleared at 5:03:01. No contact. Dock C, slip 14. First agent on the boarding ladder at 5:03:09. The team made entry at 5:03:19. The forward stateroom door was unlocked. The fixer was seated on the bunk, dressed, phone in hand. The screen showed an active call that had been placed 48 seconds earlier. At 5:02:30, precisely at the moment the flood lamps went live. He had heard the lights. He had made a call, to whom the task force would spend the next several days determining. The call lasted 11 seconds before it was interrupted by the team's entry. He was placed in handcuffs at 5:03:34, the time from breach to custody, 93 seconds. At 5:04 a.m., the Marshals supervisor transmitted a single word over the tactical channel, secure. At 5:09 a.m., agents completing a preliminary search of the vessel's salon documented the following in plain view: 2 canvas duffel bags containing a combined total of approximately $800,000 in banded US currency. A laptop computer with the screen still active, showing a spreadsheet with booking codes and wire transfer routing numbers. A satellite phone with a list of contacts in the call history. And, tucked into the chart table drawer, a folder of documents. Lease agreements for marina slips at 7 different South Florida locations, all registered to variations of the same shell charter company names identified in the financial investigation. He had not just been hiding at the marina, he had been working. The Paloma Blanca was seized by HSI at 5:31 a.m. 3 additional vessels connected to the Shell charter network were seized at other marinas in Broward County over the following 6 hours, pursuant to warrants that had been sealed and held pending the primary arrest. A 4th vessel, a 44-foot sailing catamaran registered to one of the Dominican Republic entities, was interdicted by Coast Guard in international waters off Key Biscayne at 7:18 a.m. By noon on March 13, 2026, the fixer was processed and in federal custody at the Federal Detention Center, Miami. By 2 p.m., a federal grand jury in the Southern District of Florida had returned a sealed indictment that was immediately unsealed. 23 counts, including conspiracy to launder monetary instruments, operating an unlicensed money-transmitting business, structuring transactions to evade reporting requirements, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. He was not alone in the indictment. 38 additional defendants, managers of the shell companies, correspondent bank employees, and financial intermediaries across 5 countries were named. Of those, 14 were in U.S. jurisdiction and were arrested in coordinated operations in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, New York, and Los Angeles over the following 72 hours. Here's the take that will probably get pushback. The charter industry's regulatory gap is not an accident, and it is not an oversight. It is a structural feature that has been flagged in federal financial crime reports going back to at least 2011, and nothing material has changed. The fixer did not exploit a loophole that nobody knew about. He exploited a loophole that the industry has successfully resisted closing for over a decade. That is not a failure of law enforcement. That is a failure of regulatory will. The numbers that came out of this case are staggering in their specificity. $1.6 billion laundered through 5 shell charter firms over approximately 30 months. 39 individuals indicted across 5 countries. 68 days of active pursuit. 4 vessels seized. Combined estimated value of $4.2 million. $14 million in cash recovered from the Paloma, Blanca, and associated properties. Wire transfers traced through correspondent banking relationships in 6 jurisdictions. If the fixer receives the sentence federal prosecutors are seeking, he is looking at over 20 years in federal prison. The cooperating witness, whose identity remains protected, is expected to testify against multiple co-defendants. The laptop recovered from the chart table is described in court filings as containing, quote, the most comprehensive operational record of a charter-based money laundering enterprise yet recovered by federal investigators. Analysts in the HSI Financial Crimes Unit are expected to spend months extracting and cross-referencing its contents. The 11-second phone call the fixer made at 5:02:30 a.m., in the seconds between the flood lamps going live and the team reaching his door. That call remains open in the investigation. The number he dialed has been identified. The recipient is believed to be outside US jurisdiction. That thread is active. One detail that stuck with me after going through the case materials. At the moment senior intelligence analyst Torres first flagged the Wi-Fi anomaly, the fixer's fugitive warrant had been open for 18 months. 18 months of silence, of no hits, of a file that was slowly going cold. The entire 68-day operation. 39 arrests, $1.6 billion traced, 4 vessels seized, exists because one analyst ran a subquery she almost didn't run, on a burner phone that never even connected to the internet. 3 pings to a marina Wi-Fi router. That was the thread. How many threads like that are still sitting in a queue somewhere, waiting for someone to pull them? Will this case change how the charter industry is regulated? Or will the next fixer just build a slightly more sophisticated version of the same structure? Comment yes if you think federal regulators will close the gap. Comment no if you think the next network is already running. We track what comes next. Subscribe to the Bureau files so the next case finds you first. The Paloma Blanca is currently held at a federal asset forfeiture facility in Dania Beach, Florida. Her slip at Harborview Charter Complex, Slip 14, is empty. The marina is under new management pending a civil forfeiture proceeding. The booking website for the lead shell company, the one the HSI undercover agent used to make his reservation on March 3rd, was taken offline by federal court order on the morning of March 13th. As of the date of this broadcast, it has been accessed over 11,000 times by individuals attempting to make charter reservations. The page simply says, "Closed for the season."